At 3 p.m. on November 5th, the Melbourne Cup, the race that stops the nation, will be held. Australia's biggest race in terms of cultural capital warrants a public holiday in Victoria and unofficial half-days at most workplaces across the nation. $350 million is gambled on Cup Day alone, and $657 million over the 4-day carnival. Then there are the more disturbing statistics, those found in the shadows but present since the race's inception. 2 horses died in the first ever Cup race in 1861. 6 horses have died as a result of the Melbourne Cup race since 2013. That's 6 in 6 years. If we look at the wider race season in Australia, 137 horses died on Australian racetracks from July 2016 until July 2017. And this doesn't even consider the treatment of horses off the track, who are often kept inside except for short sessions of regimented exercise, or who are often pushed past the brink of physical comfort during races. The more brutal side of the race industry is receiving further light. Even Australia's national broadcaster aired a special episode of the 7:30 report on the dark side of horse racing just weeks before the big day. However, in a 2013 piece in The Guardian, Jeff Downsing wrote the following, which warned against expecting too quick a defeat of the Cup and its ancillary economics. He wrote, "Like the untouchable oil and coal mining capers, a global Melbourne Cup audience of 700 million suggests racing authorities hold the whip hand on dissenters. There's too much at stake in an industry that generates 64,000 full-time jobs and over $1 billion in state and federal taxes per year. Furthermore, Australian thoroughbred racing claims to spend approximately $30 billion, leading to a direct economic impact of $41 billion. According to the VRC last year, the Spring Carnival alone generated $366 million economic stimulus to Victoria and $752 million nationally. Looking at these extraordinary numbers, how does one even begin to challenge such an imposing beast? And as lords of the planet's food chain, we ultimately inflict similar fates on cows, sheep, and a myriad of other creatures anyway, don't we?" This final line from Downsing implies and suggests this is a broader issue than just the race industry, and asks questions of our use of animal as labour, as pets, and as food. In all this, we might ask, what is a Christian to do? Where does treatment of horses fit in theology and Christian ethics? How does the farming, killing, and eating of non-human animals relate to our doctrines of creation, reconciliation, and redemption? Are non-human animals our neighbours, in the sense that Jesus meant when summarising the law? Can humans have meaningful, non-utilitarian relationships with non-human animals? And is that considered a witness to the prophetic vision of a redeemed world where lions lie down with the lamb? To help us navigate these questions and more, including one about Peppa Pig, I am joined by Professor David L. Clough, Professor of Theological Ethics at the University of Chester in the UK. His books include Ethics in Crisis, Interpreting Bart's Ethics, Faith and Force, A Christian Debate About War. He co-edited Creaturely Theology on God, Humans and Animals, and Animals as Religious Subjects. In 2015, he launched Creature Kind Project, which engages churches in the UK and North America with farmed animal welfare as a faith issue. Today's discussion centres on his recently completed landmark 2-volume work on animals. Volume 1, Systematic Theology, was published in 2012, and Volume 2, Theological Ethics, came out this year, both published with Bloomsbury, and both I recommend heartily. Please welcome David to Love, Rinse, Repeat. Well, David, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's really exciting to have you here and to be talking about your 2-volume work on animals, which people can pick up now, and I encourage them to do so. The second volume just came out this year.
It's one of the few examples where I encourage people to judge a book by the cover. I'm really enthusiastic about those 2 Franz Marc paintings that I managed to get on the covers.
Oh, they're really excellent. Yes, I remember when I first started to read them, my wife looked over and goes, "Oh, that looks good. Well, that looks interesting." I'm like, excellent, doing its job.
Yep.
So we're starting this conversation, and people will have heard this in the intro, to kind of talking particularly about the Melbourne Cup and I guess horse racing in particular. This is a focus of one of the chapters in the volume 2, which talks about the use of non-human animals for sport and entertainment. Mm-hmm. But I thought before we as we get into that, I guess all of this hinges on the assumption that the purpose of non-human animals isn't just for my use, isn't just to satisfy humanity's needs and wants. I mean, someone might say, like, but wait, isn't that why Adam got to name all of them? Isn't that why they were created before us and, were offered as helpers, but were deemed, not entirely adequate for that task? I guess what I'm asking in brief is, what is the why of the non-human animals that causes me to care about their life and death independent of my own?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important initial question. In a sense, it's the question that drove me to write the whole of Volume 1 on systematic theology, because I started off really wanting to write a Christian animal ethics. And what I realized when I started to get in conversation with fellow Christians in the pews and sort of elsewhere is one of the first questions was, well, didn't God make the animals for us to use? And I realized that if that basic question was undetermined or determined in what seemed to me a really problematic direction, I needed to pay some really serious attention to sort of theological underpinnings of the kind of engagement with animals that I wanted to encourage. So once you begin to ask the question, what animals are for, I think it becomes really clear that the idea that animals other than humans are for us looks like a really bad theological mistake. And there are lots of different ways we could come at that. To start with, it seems to me something as fundamental as a Christian confession of monotheism has implications here, that we worship a God who is not just a sort of local deity of the particular sort of species Homo sapiens, but the God of all creatures. And that means sort of everything made, including, black holes and distant stars and galaxies and so on. So we start off needing a theology that's big enough to encompass God's relationships to all of those creatures and recognize ourselves as one creature among that myriad range of creatures that God made, all of whom sort of glorify God in their flourishing. And so once we realize that God is the God of all creatures, then it seems to me, we go back to read Genesis 1, and you say, well, human beings are created last there. When some early Jewish and Christian thinkers were looking at that passage of Genesis 1, they thought being created last looked like some kind of embarrassment. So Philo of Alexandria, Jewish philosopher in the first century, I sort of imagine has Plato's Timaeus, so this contemporary account of creation on one side and Genesis 1 on the other. And Plato's Timaeus looks like it really does privilege the human, because human soul is created first, and then gets wrapped around with all the rest of the sort of creaturely reality in the universe in order to protect this vulnerable human soul from the forces that will otherwise destroy it. So in Plato's account, human beings are literally at the center of everything. And Philo and other early Christian theologians had to kind of make an apology of, well, why don't humans look more important in the Genesis account? Why does God wait till day 6 to create humans and creates them on the same day as all the other land animals? And so that was really, when I first encountered that, it made me read Genesis in a new way and to realize that we have 5 whole days of creation where God is delighting in the being of all of these other kinds of creatures in their own right, without any regard to their purpose in relation to other creaturely life, declares the creatures of all those different days good, before humans are on the scene. And so we need to seriously question the idea that I think is pretty widespread in popular Christian imagination, that God made animals for us. I think it's an unbiblical idea. I think there's really strong theological reasons to worry about that attempt to, what seems to me, import our own sense of self-importance into the biblical text.
That's great, and really helpful, laying the groundwork for where we're going to go. So your work on horse racing exists in a chapter that also includes your discussion on big game hunting and circuses, among a few other things, and like fishing and other hunting. I think that proximity is important as it kind of complicates some of the distinctions people might erect between different forms of non-human animals in sports and entertainment, or kind of bring into conversations around fairness and things like that. What did you want to, I guess, demonstrate by putting these together in that chapter?
So in volume 2, I was trying to provide a fairly comprehensive survey of the ways we're using other animals. And so I talk about food and labor and textiles and experimentation and pets and companion animals. As I tried to think about the right categories there, one kind of category seemed to be, well, what's the reason we give for our use? So, we use lots and lots of animals for food because we want to eat them. And so that's important characterization. The uses I tried to group together in the chapter that included horse racing is, I think sometimes the answer we give for our use of other animals is it's fun. We really enjoy it. It makes us, it entertains us. And so whether that's people who like going fishing and maybe they would prefer not to be killing the fish, but they just like the activity of catching the fish and then maybe releasing them again. That's a sort of entertainment. It's a sort of leisure pursuit. And it seems to me that it's appropriate to group together the kinds of uses that we make of animals just for fun, because there's a particular moral question there. We can query the necessity of whether or not we need to use animals for food or for textiles or for research experimentation. There's interesting conversations to be had there. But it seems to me really obvious that the question of necessity fails when we're using animals for fun. We can have fun in lots of ways. We don't need to be causing suffering and death of animals for fun. And so that seems to be a really important categorical distinction to make. That there would need a very, very high standard of justification to defend the idea of causing fellow animal creatures of God suffering and death just for our own entertainment.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think also what we see with horse racing is, and you kind of touch on this in the book, the sport of watching horses run really fast isn't what really brings people to the races anymore. It is the gambling industry, as the kind of attraction we have to putting money on something that has an uncertain outcome. And as that's become more other ways of doing that, obviously the horse racing has taken a bit of a dip, but I think that itself, shapes the way that we think about horse racing and about the use of non-human animals in this kind of way. Is that it's not even about, you could say, oh, I like to see horses at their most natural, which is them running fast, and I don't get to see that in the plains, so I can do it here. So the fact that it's really being shifted into an economic activity also challenges the way we're using horses in this.
Yeah, the scales really fell from my eyes on that when I began reading the sort of annual reports of the UK racing industry and began to look at the reports they were making financially about how horse racing was going in the UK. And horse racing is on the decline in the UK, which I'm glad to see. And the thing that's driving the number of races, and this was what really surprised me, is that the gambling industry needs events for people to be putting money on. And so that's where a lot of the funding comes for this whole elaborate extravagance of horse racing in the UK and elsewhere. And that means that lots of the races that are being staged day by day and week by week in the UK, and I'm sure in Australia too, are there just to create events with an uncertain outcome that the gambling industry can sell to people to gamble on. And so that intersection between the promotion of gambling and this animal event with, as we'll talk about, considerable negative effects on the animals wrapped up in them, that the economics of it really, really struck me strongly when I was researching this. I would say it's complicated. I'm sure. I mean, there are lots of people involved in the industry who, would talk about how they love horses. They came into the industry. The people who are looking after race horses in their stables are, animal lovers. People who are riding horses. I'm sure we'll talk about the delight of interacting so closely with this particular creature. I'm sure a lot of the people who are going do have this experience of sort of delighting in the excellence of these creatures. And so I think, that's part of the mix. But as soon as we begin to engage with that kind of potential sort of sympathy for animals, that really heightens the questions to find out what it's like and what the implications are for the animals concerned. And I think a lot of the people who are going along and having some of that sense of, aren't these horses magnificent, would be really troubled if they began to realize what the lives of these horses are like.
Now, there might be some people who are watching this who are thinking, oh, this is just, virtue signaling PC lefty Christians of the 21st century. But kind of as you show in this chapter, Christians who engage in particularly hunting or even the spectacles of animals racing and fighting stand outside of much of the tradition of the church, from early Christians to later saints to key reformers. I guess, can you speak a little to the way the tradition has kind of had a voice on this topic that I guess emerged out of, as you say in the book, the fact that they often shared the same fate in those early days?
Yeah, and this goes way back. I think we need to really attend to how the sort of depth of the depth of feeling within biblical, Jewish, and later Christian tradition goes in relation to killing animals for fun. So killing animals in the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Old Testament is a problem. And it's hedged around by all kinds of conditions and permissions. God does give permission for the first time for killing of animals in Genesis 9 after the flood, but says make sure you don't consume the animal with its blood, which is its life, the thing that it has in common with humans. And then obviously is the sort of Jewish ancient Israelite law puts astonishing careful conditions about when it's permissible to kill animals. And one of those things is wild animals are off the menu for Israel. That's not the kind of clean animal that you get to eat. You couldn't be killing and consuming animals in a way that was sort of fit for the law in the vast majority of cases. And so you have this particular space of legitimate killing, but going out and hunting wild animals is beyond the bounds. And it's really interesting to see that carried through into Jewish and Christian traditions in sort of post-biblical times. This real sense of, okay, we could defend the killing of animals for food when we need to on the basis of this necessity. But the idea about going out and killing wild animals for fun consistently gets rejected by Jewish and Christian thinkers, and is as an example of just a failure to comprehend the meaning of the lives of these fellow creatures. So my favorite example of this is Ivan the Terrible. So this Russian leader who's a tyrant and horrifically cruel to humans in warfare and other ways. And he was persuaded by the church in Russia that he should stop hunting animals because it was counter to his Christian faith. And so he did. He stopped hunting animals at the same time as he's pursuing all of these sort of warring policies in relation to fellow human beings. And so that gives you a sense of how this particular issue of killing animals for fun sort of fits in a Christian context. And the other striking bit of the history for me came when I was researching. So I'm a Methodist, a member of the British Methodist Church, and it's really striking to find that John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, was particularly concerned about cruelties towards animals. And when I was researching into that a bit further, one of my questions was, how far did Wesley's concern about animal cruelty follow through into early Methodism and the kind of thinking of other evangelicals? And it turns out it's a really big concern. And so I was looking through in the John Rylands library near me here in Manchester. I was looking through early editions of the Methodist magazine and things, which are in the late 18th, early 19th century. And they're filled with reproducing sermons against animal cruelty. And the animal cruelties they're most concerned with in that period are blood sports. So really nasty contemporary practices of killing animals and causing suffering and death to animals in lots of ways, but also, interestingly, abuse of animals. So strikingly, one sermon, early 19th century, talks about an example where people had bet on the outcome of whether a horse could be sort of raced over a ridiculously long distance, like 100 miles or something, over a particular period of hours. And the preacher, I think this is in Bath Abbey, the preacher says, look, this is just a colossal example of our abuse of our position and power over these fellow creatures. And it's just, an obvious example of our thoughtless cruelty and unchristian attitudes towards fellow creatures. I'm also struck that this gets picked up, cruelty towards animals gets picked up as a key indicator for C.S. Lewis in his writings. So people probably familiar with his Narnia writings, where animals play a big role, and talking animals, this big feature of the Narnian universe. But in addition, he has this science fiction trilogy, Perelandra, where it turns out that needless cruelty towards animals is the clearest example C.S. Lewis finds in the whole of the trilogy for what a satanic attitude towards fellow creatures looks like. So he has this satanic figure, Watson, who just needlessly destroys and leaves sort of suffering and dying fellow animal creatures. And so I think it's a really deep sense, deep within Christian biblical and theological traditions, that this needless cruelty towards animals is always going to be a particular scandal in a Christian context.
That's really helpful. And I think that we can kind of maybe sidestep here into kind of the way the two volumes work with the tradition. Like we've seen there, this sense of a kind of a retrieval of, hey, the church has paid a lot more attention to animals than we do now. One of my favorite sections in volume 1 is the recounting of a long ecclesial court case about whether was it weevils? No,
Yeah. So weevils attacking grain was
a long ecclesial court case, and you cite that, and you've cited other sermons from earlier in the church, but then there's the retrieval aspect. There's also an expansion aspect, and you see that with particularly your work with Bart, which is to kind of go like, look, if you just take the category Bart is working with and open it up a little bigger, the dogmatics can hold and say something about all this. So do you want to talk a little about how you kind of, you're not trying, early in the book, like, this is not just like, I'm just picking this up from nowhere. You're engaging the tradition in this kind of both a retrieval and an expansion, and sometimes a critique based on, we just know more now. But yeah, do you want to talk a little about that and what kind of fueled that choice?
Yeah, it was really crucial to me to be having an argument at the heart of Christian texts and traditions. So there have been some attempts that have been sort of finding sort of marginal references in texts that we haven't really considered central, or thinkers that we haven't really considered, crucial for the tradition, and to identify, sort of major landmarks in the Christian tradition as just sort of getting it wrong in relation to animals. I wanted to do something much more wholehearted in relation to my theological engagement. I wanted an argument right at the heart of where we've put together sort of key ideas, on the basis that I think actually that there's a strong internal trajectory, even if not often recognized, that does drive us towards a really radical appreciation of what it means to be living alongside fellow creatures of the God that we worship. And so I had a real confidence that diving deep into the heart of the tradition, asking questions almost for the first time in relation to animals, and really pushing as far as I could to work out what the best theological argument here is. I had a deep confidence that was going to come out okay. That core deep Christian commitments were directing us to a deep appreciation and empathy with our sort of fellow creatures of God. And that means for me, as you say, sort of strong critique at certain points. So Augustine, for example, defends killing of animals on the basis that they don't have society with us in reason. So he sort of takes on quite a sort of commonplace within Greek thought that rationality was a key distinguisher between humans and other animals, and he uses that as the justification for it's wrong to kill humans, but it's okay to kill non-human animals. And so that's there's an example there of, okay, so that's an argument we find in the tradition. That's the argument Augustine uses. What happens when we subject that to critical scrutiny? First of all, we know rationality is not a sort of on-off binary now. There are degrees of rationality, both within and beyond the human. So we know some humans are more rational than others in terms of their cognitive ability. And so that Augustine's definition of rationality as this kind of key identifier causes problems if we want to think about a moral responsibility to human infants or people with severe learning disability or people with dementia. So using cognitive functioning or ability is a problem internal to the human case. And then we also have made all kinds of discoveries about the rationality of non-human animals. We find that dolphins can sort of pass grammar, P-A-R-S-E grammar, so they can understand how sentence structure is formed in relation to instructions to them. We find parrots can work with abstract concepts like color and shape. So Alex the parrot, you could show the parrot what's the difference between these objects, and Alex could tell you whether or not the difference was color or shape, and so on. And then lots of examples in relation to primates of a deep sense of fairness, a deep sense of fairness and justice, and even being prepared to sort of forego rewards because they thought it was unfair. Someone else was getting rewarded better for a particular piece of work than primates. So rationality, we need to recognize, is a continuum across the non-human and human world. And of course there are degrees, but the idea that we ought to decide whether or not a particular being is killable or not on the basis of their rational functioning, just for all kinds of ethical and theological reasons, looks like a very, very bad way to set this up. And so that's an example for me of how if we engage deep with the tradition and really push questions, I think we can find really interesting novel answers. And I've got enough respect for Augustine to think, well, if he was in the room and or on the call and we were having these arguments, I think he would. It seems to me he would want to concede some ground here in relation to whether rationality works. And once we begin to open that question, that forces us to rethink quite significant parts of where animals feature in the later tradition. So Thomas Aquinas, who excluded animals from moral duties for Christians, either under justice or charity, is heavily dependent on Augustine at that point. Similar arguments, and I think there are wider trajectories in Aquinas's thought, which again drive us to a much broader appreciation of what it might mean to live well as Christians alongside other animals. And Bart's another case in point. So mid 20th century Swiss thinker. He at some points he could be understood as saying God sets up the whole of the universe, the whole creation is ordered to express this covenant between God and Homo sapiens. And so the creation is the external basis of the covenant, Bart says. I think that's a really, really significant problem, not just for the anthropocentrism, the sort of human-centeredness that he critiques elsewhere in the dogmatics, but also, just for the plausibility of Christian doctrine. Once we begin to realize that we are, circling one of a billion stars in one of a billion similarly sized galaxies in our universe, I think we need to be very careful about putting the whole truth and plausibility of Christian faith on the basis of we're the center of things.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think, you're right. There's the amount of ways things just kind of dominoes kind of start tipping once you start asking some of these key questions, or make the early assumptions that we've kind of talked about the purpose of the animal, the non-human animal.
Sorry, the other bit that excites me about that is that it begins to become clear that once you push this question about non-human animals, it provokes you to all kinds of interesting theological thinking that goes way beyond the animals. So Claude Levi-Strauss said animals are good to think with, and I think that's true theologically as well. It helps us to a better account of theology, to sort of push these questions that follow from attending to how we, what place these fellow creatures should have in our thought. And I think it can be good for Christian theology to be thinking with animals. I mean, both for the sake of animals and for us, but also more broadly for the coherence of the project.
That's really helpful. So as we keep wading out from our initial starting point to the broader work of the book, some might say, with the horse racing thing, or even with food, that our engagement with these non-human animals somehow does give them, a significance. These horses, they, do give us some sense of entertainment and joy, and doesn't that honor them in some way? Or this animal that is killed from eating, that sustains my life and brings together the family around the table, and that bestows it some significance. So I thought it would be helpful to ask, I guess, because you talk about all animals, human and non-human, having a vocation. And that all creatures somehow, their meaning is about living before God in a particular way. I guess can you unpack that a bit, I guess, what that means for the non-human animal and how that kind of speaks back into what we've been talking about so far?
So one of the reference points for me here in recognizing how we think about the vocations of all creatures is that great piece of creation theology, Psalm 104. And so Psalm 104 lays out it sort of unwraps the whole of this sort of creaturely space and celebrates the God who is the maker and sustainer of all these different creatures, puts them each in their creaturely space. And going back to Bart for a moment, Bart's a bit embarrassed that human beings are just mentioned in passing about halfway through the psalm. And for me, that's a really good reminder to us that we need to recognize that we have this place alongside other creatures. And the Psalms and the wisdom literature more broadly, and sort of scripture as a whole, then, I think leads us to the sense that each of these creatures have their own place, have their own particular mode of being, and glorify God in that particular mode of flourishing. So, as I look out of my window, I'm seeing trees that are just in the UK coming into autumn, sort of changing color of their leaves. And it seems to me that, the vocation of an oak tree, is to take in nourishment and grow and thrive, and delight its creator in its flourishing, and then yes, also provide a space for sort of other creatures to be hospitable to other creatures. There's a particular way of being an oak tree that glorifies the creator of that oak tree, and every creature has their own particular vocation before God and a particular mode of flourishing. I just sort of imagine a God who is delighting in the particularity. When we're watching a sort of David Attenborough nature documentary and wondering about these, just being amazed at these sea creatures and all their their difference and strangeness and beauty, it seems to me that that's a theological response. That's a sense in which all of these creatures are doing their creaturely thing before God, and that's their calling. That's their vocation. And so we have a particular distinctive calling. Sometimes people misunderstand what I'm saying in volume 1 to say that I'm sort of trying to flatten everything out and there's nothing distinctive about being human. I don't mean that at all. We have our particular distinctive, astonishing way of being a creature of God, and we're called to do that in as creative and full and as full a way as we can, using all of the particular gifts that we're given as creatures to praise and worship our God in the way we live. But we need to recognize that that every other creature is also doing their thing. The black hole is doing its thing. The mountain, it's doing its thing. The hills in the Psalms are clapping their hands, in response to God's grace. And so, Jesus in his teaching, when people tell the crowds to be quiet on Palm Sunday, he says, well, if they were quiet, the stones would be crying out. And I think it just gives you an astonishing sense that the whole of the creaturely world has to do with the divine, and has to do with God. And the first Christologies in Colossians and Ephesians talking about the God who is reconciling all things in heaven and earth to God's self. And so it starts to me to seem slightly mystifying how we've thought that we're the only creature with a calling, or the only creature with a vocation, or the only creature that matters to God, when we've inherited texts which say exactly the contrary.
I think that becomes then a really helpful lens through how we think about our treatment of non-human animals. Is my engagement with them stopping them living that particular life before God? Mm-hmm. I guess a question I want to ask that comes out of that, which I was thinking about, as you're reading the book, and you do address this, is, so, okay, you watch the David Attenborough thing, and we watch a lion chase down a gazelle, and we're like, that is a lion being a lion. Yet, the prophetic visions are the lion will lie down with the lamb, and that this kind of desire to, and need to hunt and kill be removed. But I guess, does that raise a question that this kind of redemptive vision is somehow removing the particularity of the lion or the lamb or whatever it might be?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, because it sort of really begins, thinking again. I think thinking about animals is good for theology, because as we try and think about some of these questions in the context of a theological engagement with evolutionary theory and a sort of science or religion dialogue, recognizing that our theology needs to have something to say about the more than human world, provokes really hard questions at this point. And so we've got what seem to me non-negotiable visions of what it would look like for God's reign to be fully present in the human and more than human world. And so we've got a vision in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 about what peaceable relations between creatures look like. No one's getting killed and eaten in those visions. We've got Isaiah's visions of what's it going to look like when the Messiah comes. Well, one of the first signs is the wolf is going to lie down with the lamb. And so this intra-creaturely violence, both between different kinds of wild animals and between humans and other animals, is no longer present in Isaiah's vision of the messianic reign. We've got Paul's vision of a creation that's currently groaning in labor pains, but those pains are going to come to a productive end, and creation is going to be liberated from its bondage to decay. And John Wesley was really insistent that included the animals. The animals were going to be redeemed in his Sermon on the General Deliverance. And then we've got this sort of Revelation vision of worship in the new creation, where you've got a lamb in the center standing as if slain, and then these four weird human-animal hybrid creatures from Ezekiel kind of popping up, and then humans, and then every creature in heaven and earth and in the air and the land and the sea worshipping God. So we've got this sense that God has to do with all of these different creatures. And now you need to remind me what the question, where we were headed with that question, because I got so excited about these creaturely visions.
So does that then challenge this idea that God, that the vocation is living their particularity? Because isn't the particularity of the lion to be a predator?
Yeah, right. So a friend of mine, Chris Southgate, wrote a book called The Groaning of Creation, where he's really concerned to how we can how we can understand the violence that seems present in the evolutionary process, where creatures live and die and develop through sort of scarcity and contest and so on, and a Christian theology of creation. And he wants to take really seriously the idea, I think the phrase he uses, which is a quotation, and I can't remember from whom, that the gazelle's leg is carved by the lion's jaw or something like that. But the idea that, gazelles have achieved their creaturely excellence in contest with lions achieving their creaturely excellence, because they're each driven to become, lion driven to become a better and better predator, and that drives a gazelle to become a faster and faster escapee. And so their creaturely excellence seems to be kind of knit together with this evolutionary process. And that drives Chris to say that a lion must still be a predator in the new creation, because the essence of lion is predator. And so he has this, what seems to me a really nasty picture of gazelles continuing to get eaten by lions in the new creation, but it doesn't hurt them, and then they get resurrected to get eaten again. And so that's one way of resolving the tension, it seems to me. But that seems to me to give up really, really significant parts of the sort of scripture on theological witness, that we worship a God who desires a peaceful coexistence between creatures. And for me, then, that means that I'm driven in a different theological direction. And so the way that I begin to engage with this question is to recognize that what we're dealing with in seeing the relationship between lions and gazelles is just another particularization of the problem of evil that we've kind of have to engage with much more fully, or have to at least to live with. So we find ourselves in the midst, we wake up and come to consciousness and find ourselves in the midst of a world that we realize is a pretty nasty place for a lot of the time, both for humans and for other animals. Humans prey on each other in various really problematic and nasty ways. So yesterday or the day before, in the UK, we're waking up to seeing these 39 Chinese immigrants have died in this kind of refrigerated ratio. So humans are preying on each other all of the time, and that's a pretty nasty thing. And we find that non-human animals are also preying on each other in lots of ways. And for me, we need to recognize those two issues in continuity. We need to recognize the world is not as God would have it. And a fundamental Christian response to this violent world is to recognize that this does not fully express the will of the God that made us. And we long for, with Paul and that groaning creation, we long for the time when this groaning will be overcome, and God's will be truly done on earth as it is in heaven. But for me, that means that we don't need to ontologize the violence of the lion any more than we ontologize the violence of fellow humans. If I'm going to be fit for that new creation, there's an astonishing change that will need to take place in me to become a peaceable person that could dwell peaceably with fellow creatures in that new creation. And it seems to me that's a much bigger change than is going to be required of the lion. Lions enjoy all kinds of things apart from chasing gazelles. We get obsessed by their violence, but we don't, rather than their maternal care or their, love for lounging around in the sunshine. So I think we need to be really careful to avoid picking on this kind of particular fascination that a certain reception of Darwinian theory has for violence and for contest, and the way that that's used ideologically in all kinds of ways. I think there are certain nature documentaries tradition that that are very ideologically driven in that way, and kind of fascination with the violence, and maybe that has a role in legitimizing intrahuman violence as well. And I think we need to be prepared to be affirming of a robust theological vision that says, no, violence is not how our God creates. And that, that doesn't end the difficulty of giving an account of theology and evolution, which I think we need, but I think it closes off the attractiveness of certain routes, including the one that Chris Southgate pursues.
Thank you for that. That was really helpful and insightful. So I live in the house with a 2.5-year-old. So I've got some questions based on animals and family TV shows and movies.
Right. Wow, okay.
You can choose where you take them in terms of responses. We've kind of covered some of it, I guess, but you can see how you go. So we're going to start with probably the biggest UK export of this millennium, Peppa Pig. So Peppa Pig and other anthropomorphized, or shows where animals are anthropomorphized to act like people, are they helpful or a hindrance in breaking down the many ill-informed theological and philosophical attempts to create a division between humans and other animals?
Interesting. Yeah. So today we're just celebrating the 15th birthday of our youngest child. So Peppa Pig, I think we could just kind of missed it in relation to sort of parental engagement. But I think the first really fascinating thing is, what are all those animals doing in like every children's book and every children's TV program? I mean, they're absolutely everywhere. It seems like we can't imagine what it would be like to engage our children imaginatively with the world, except through engagement with animals. And that, I think, is a really interesting and fascinating starting point. And it seems to me to be something that's both interesting and that we should be sort of strongly affirming. It seems to me that the sort of deep wisdom, which probably goes back way beyond Aesop's fables, in terms of ancient literature, this deep sense that one of the primary things that we need to do with these new humans is induct them into this space of living among fellow creatures. That seems like a really interesting thing to affirm and celebrate. And I'm always struck by what must be a near universal sense in meat-eating households for young children to suddenly realize these cuddly creatures that have been around the crib and around the bedside and in all these storybooks are also, their bodies are littering the plates of what their sort of trusted parents are giving them to eat. There must be a particularly, however that's negotiated, that must be something that a disconnect that pretty much every child fed meat needs to engage with. But kind of onto the more particular question about sort of anthropomorphization. So I think there's an unhappy history about concern about anthropomorphization. So there was, until recently, there was a sort of scientific kind of concern that we need to recognize that any attempt to identify with other creatures and attribute anything like human emotions or whatever to other creatures was a sort of a misstepping. I think we need to recognize that fellow creatures are like and unlike us in myriad ways, and the sort of animal studies that have come through in recent decades have been demonstrating that of course we're unlike other animals in lots of ways, but we also have significant continuity. So once you've realized that monkeys have a sense of justice, then you recognize that it's not improper to say, well, that monkey is grumpy because he's been treated unfairly. The other monkey got a grape when they did that task, but this monkey didn't, and so he's kind of sitting, maybe not quite with his arms crossed and kind of grumpy, but he's we can sort of empathize with that, and that's not problematic anthropomorphization. That's a proper recognition of continuity. But anthropomorphization can go wrong. So there are people that are sort of dressing animals up in all kinds of costumes that may not be terribly comfortable and kind of thinking of them as something other than they are. So we need to be attentive to what creatures actually are. But so in the sort of Peppa Pig world, I think to think about other animals as first of all capable of relationship, part of their own creaturely space where they've got interactions with other animals, capable of kind of love and concern and empathy. That seems to me an entirely unproblematic thing to be doing. Indeed, the lives of the saints have quite a lot in common with some of those things in terms of seeing non-human animals as quite capable of responding to humans, feeling contrition, feeling humility, feeling compassion, and those are things that are present in our hagiographies as well as in contemporary children's literature.
Thank you for that. So the next one I want to ask is about the show The Octonaughts, which if you were not in the year of Peppa Pig, you won't be in the year of Octonaughts, which is basically the premise is a polar bear, a cat, and a penguin are like an A-team-esque, going out and helping other sea creatures. I don't know why a cat's involved. He's a pirate. I guess that explains it. But their tagline is to explore, rescue, protect. And I was watching an episode the other day where they helping a bunch of baby sea turtles who have to, get born on an island, and something happens to the island, so they move into another island so they'll be safe. And then when they hatch, there are birds which want to attack the sea turtles, so they help the sea turtles get to the water. Now, I guess you talk about the complex web of relationships, particularly when it comes to ethics, around how we engage animals as we meet them. And so I guess the question I have is are we meant to take, the love thy neighbor, the good Samaritan, that it's the proximity of actual proximity and not the proximity of kind, which should motivate us to act to help an animal in need or a person in need or whatever in need? Or should it be a more leave no trace, hands off because the bird needs to eat to live kind of approach? Or is a binary such as that just part of the problem? Mm-hmm. That's my Octonaughts question.
Yeah, so I think that's a really deep question. So as I engage with the sort of thinking about our relationships with other animals, one of the things I was surprised to find is that engaging in depth in the biblical and theological tradition seemed to bring me out in a different place than some contemporary animal advocates were. So there's kind of it's a slight caricature, but you could kind of think of a wilderness ethic where the kind of primary human responsibility is just to leave well alone. We'll just kind of establish zones of separation. The ideal would be for humans just to sort of withdraw, to leave space for so-called wild nature, and for us to sort of have nothing to do with it. It seems to me that the picture we're given in biblical and theological tradition is not that one. It seems we've got these kind of visions of harmonious coexistence, and God knows we're not very good at that harmonious coexistence. But the ideal seems to be to live well with rather than to cut ourselves off from. And there seems to be a really good sense in that. Both theoretically and practically now. First of all, it's a very odd thing to think that this one species, Homo sapiens, is a special case that should be considered an entirely different sort of category in an ecological sense from all others, from all other species. So I think if we are committed to the idea of thinking of ourselves alongside fellow species, it's the odd idea that we kind of have to exclude ourselves from creaturely spaces because we're not really like we're not really a creature like them. So that's kind of one a theoretical reason, but also given that there is practically no place on Earth now which is unimpacted by our activity, I think we need to recognize that the really key ethical challenge is how we are to enable the flourishing of other creatures alongside us, because there's no space in a sense that's not alongside, on the planet, given the scope of our activity. So we definitely need to be leaving, well alone in lots of respects. But I don't think that means just detaching ourselves as if we could from this widerly creaturely world. One of the things I was really struck by when I was writing about companion animal relationships is there's some suggestions that domestication of dogs might go back a really, really long way, and much further than previously thought, maybe more than 100,000 years ago, which is about as long as we've been humans, language using humans in a way we might recognize ourselves. And so that seems to me to be an interesting thought to think alongside this biblical inheritance, that we've never been human except in relationship to fellow animal creatures. And so the idea, so we need to be thinking about how to live well in that space rather than think about detaching ourselves. And I think that's really then interesting and challenging in relation to the kind of engagements that you describe. So I was away with our younger daughter, whose birthday is today, in the summer at a festival, and a Christian arts festival called Greenbelt here. And at one point, she noticed that in the sort of tracking that they'd put down on the grass, that meant that a lot of bugs had sort of fallen into gaps between the tracking and couldn't get out. And that made her stop and want to spend time lifting the bugs out of those spaces and releasing them to be able to sort of get away and do their creaturely things. And that just really struck me as a sense of what it might be to be responsible. And of course, the task is the task was huge. He could have easily spent the whole of the rest of our time there just doing that one thing. But it reminded me of a story that Karl Barth told of a German theologian, unnamed German theologian after the First World War, who was sort of going back to his home and found particular creatures sort of not able to cross a particular weir in Bamberg, and he sort of spent a lot of time there, and then had to leave, but he kept going back because he wanted to sort of help these creatures. Unfortunately, we're not God, or fortunately, we're not God. We can't save all of these other creatures. We're finite creatures, and it's beyond our strength. And there are particular kinds of initiatives that would be really ill-advised, like preventing, even if we could, preventing lions killing gazelles, all of the time, would obviously be disastrous for lions in the current context. It might turn out to be quite bad, as it turns out, for gazelles within the particular ecological network. So we need to recognize that we're not God. We don't have powers or wisdom to be able to establish prematurely this kind of peaceable kingdom through our own efforts. But that doesn't mean, I think that means we've still got a responsibility to within the animals that are our neighbours, and the animals that we meet and live alongside, how do we do well by them? And for me, that immediately makes me rush. People often ask me, "Oh yeah, but what about? Should we be saving gazelles from lions, David?" Where I say, and my primary response is, well, the magnitude of what we're doing in relation to our consumption of domesticated animals, which are now, 96% of the biomass of animal biomass on Earth is human and domesticated animal. We've kind of, the magnitude of our operations is so extreme that it seems we ought to be concerned about how we can continue to make space for wild animals in that context. But the urgent thing for us to do is attend to the animals that we're raising for food, because in terms of scale and impacts and the astonishingly impoverished lives it inflicts on animals, that's kind of way beyond anything that we could possibly find fault for lions for in terms of their impacts on fellow creatures.
Thank you for that. This has been absolutely phenomenal conversation, and there's like so much more we could cover. And if you are listening and you're like, there's so much more they need to cover, that's why there are these two excellent books that you can pick up and read, and lots more will be covered. David, is there anything you want to promote or draw people's attention to beyond buying and reviewing the books online and all those things that help? Anything else you want to draw people's attention to?
Thanks. So one thing I would really encourage people to have a look at, if they're interested in how Christians might engage with animals as a faith issue, and perhaps how they could encourage fellow Christians to be beginning to think about this stuff, is to look up the website of the organization I set up a few years ago with Sarah Withrow King called Creature Kind. So the website is becreaturekind.org. And that's got a whole range of resources for beginning to think about animals in a Christian context, including a free 6-week course with video and Bible study and theological text and a leader's guide and stuff that I piloted during Lent in my church here in Chester. And so it's a really good way of just opening up questions, the kinds of theological questions, and then some of the ethical implications that we've been talking about. And lots of people have said that that's worked really well in their church context for getting really good conversations going. So that's becreaturekind.org. The other thing I'm really hoping will go viral quite quickly is a spin-off from Creature Kind called Default Veg. And so in a few contexts where I work, like the department at my university and some of the academic conferences I go to, I've just proposed, or what if when we did catering, we made vegetarian vegan the default, and then if people want to eat meat, they can request it as a special meal. And so that just shifts the default. Everyone can still eat what they want, but the default is vegetarian vegan. And so that has the macro effect of reducing consumption of animal products, which we know is a really good idea for human reasons, for animal reasons, and for environmental reasons. But it sidesteps quite a lot of the standard objections of who are you to tell me what to eat. So you can find defaultveg.com, you can find sort of resources for thinking about how you might propose that policy. And that it's a spin-off from Creature Kind, because I began to realize that could apply to any organization. And so any company or institution or church or anything you belong to, anything that does events catering, could just make that simple, cost-free switch. It would be great for humans, the animals, and the planet. That's excellent. And for anyone interested in the Creature Kind, there's an interview, not in the podcast stream, but on the YouTube channel with Sarah, with Ro King. We talk about it a bunch as well. So if you want more information, you can find it there. David, thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope lots of people are inspired to get the book and think through theology, in conversation with these issues. Thanks, Liam. It's been good to talk with you.